September 14th, 1943. Warsaw Central Station, German-occupied Poland. Gestapo Oberscharführer Klaus Werner watched a middle-aged British woman in a worn wool coat shuffle toward the platform gate, a battered suitcase in each hand. Nothing unusual. Another foreign national leaving the general government, probably heading back to neutral territory through Sweden. Then he noticed the weight. The woman, perhaps 55, gray hair pinned under a faded scarf, moved like someone carrying stones, not clothing. Her shoulders strained. Her gait was labored, deliberate. Werner had inspected thousands of travelers. He knew what luggage should weigh. He stepped forward. "Halt! Papers!" The woman stopped. She set down the suitcases with visible relief and produced a British passport. Mary Williamson, born Manchester, 1888. Occupation: teacher, retired. Reason for travel: returned to Britain via Stockholm after volunteer work with the Polish Relief Committee. Werner flipped through the passport. Multiple entry stamps. She'd been coming to Poland since 1939, before the invasion. Strange. Most British nationals had fled in September 1939 when Wehrmacht tanks crossed the border. This woman had kept returning. Open the suitcases. Mary Williamson's hands trembled slightly as she worked the latches. The first suitcase opened. Werner looked inside. Children's clothing. Small dresses, boys' trousers, knitted sweaters, all used, carefully folded, and underneath, wrapped in cloth, rounds of dark bread, hard cheese, jars of preserves. "For displaced children in Sweden," Williamson said in accented German. "Donations from church groups in Warsaw." Werner studied her face. She met his eyes steadily, a grandmother doing charity work. What Werner didn't know, what German intelligence wouldn't discover until after the war, was that Mary Williamson would smuggle 200 Jewish children out of Poland before 1945, and the methods she used would never appear in any official resistance manual. By September 1943, Nazi Germany's systematic murder of European Jews had been operational for over 2 years. The Wannsee Conference of January 1942 had formalized the final solution: the bureaucratic extermination of 11 million Jews across occupied Europe. Poland, with its pre-war Jewish population of 3.3 million, became the primary killing ground. The statistics were catastrophic. By autumn 1943, the Germans had murdered approximately 2 million Polish Jews. The Warsaw Ghetto, which had confined 450,000 Jews in an area of 1.3 square miles, had been liquidated in May 1943 after a month-long uprising. The surviving population, roughly $50,000, had been transported to Treblinka extermination camp. Nearly all were dead within weeks. But approximately 28,000 Jews remained in Warsaw, hidden in cellars, attics, sewers, and false-walled apartments. They survived on forged identity papers, the silence of Polish protectors, and an underground network that provided food, medical supplies, and warnings about German raids. The network was called Żegota, the Polish Council to Aid Jews, established in December 1942. Żegota faced an impossible problem. Hiding adults was difficult, but achievable. Adults could stay silent during searches, could work to earn money for bribes, could pass as Polish if their appearance and language skills were adequate. Children were different. Young children couldn't maintain cover stories under interrogation. They might cry at the wrong moment, speak Yiddish accidentally, or fail to recite Catholic prayers that every Polish child knew. And they couldn't work. They were dependents, requiring food and care that strained their protectors' resources. The solution, obvious but unattainable, was evacuation. Get children out of Poland entirely, to neutral countries where they wouldn't need to hide. Sweden accepted Jewish refugees. So did Switzerland, though Swiss border guards frequently turned refugees back. The problem was transit. Getting a Jewish child from Warsaw to Stockholm required crossing 800 miles of German-occupied territory, passing through multiple security checkpoints, and avoiding the Gestapo, SS, Wehrmacht military police, and Polish collaborators who reported Jews for bounties of 500 zloty, roughly a month's wages. Adult Jews attempting this journey faced near certain capture. German security forces knew what to look for: circumcised men, women who looked Semitic, anyone with suspicious papers or nervous behavior. Capture meant immediate execution or transport to Auschwitz. The statistics were brutal. Fewer than 2% of Jews who attempted escape from occupied Poland via overland routes survived. Children presented a different calculation. If properly disguised, with authentic papers and a plausible cover story, a child might pass inspection. The key was the escort. An escort needed legitimate reason to travel, needed papers that would withstand scrutiny, and needed to appear utterly ordinary. Someone a checkpoint guard would wave through without detailed inspection. Żgota had few such people. Most resistance members were young Poles with forged papers of their own, constantly at risk. Using them as escorts meant potentially exposing the entire network if one was captured and interrogated. What the organization desperately needed were people with legitimate diplomatic or humanitarian status, people the Germans couldn't easily arrest, whose papers couldn't be questioned. They needed foreign nationals. In September 1942, a British woman named Mary Williamson walked into a Żgota contact point in Warsaw and made an unusual offer. She was 54 years old, a retired school teacher from Manchester who had lived in Poland since 1936, teaching English to Polish children in private schools. She had remained in Warsaw through the invasion and occupation, ostensibly doing volunteer work with refugee relief organizations. Her British passport gave her privileges most Poles didn't have: freedom of movement, reduced scrutiny at checkpoints, and potential evacuation routes through neutral countries. She told the Żgota representative that she wanted to help smuggle children to Sweden. She had a plan. It involved suitcases, children's clothing, and something she called baking cakes. The Żgota operative listened. The plan was absurd. Dependent on German gullibility and extraordinary luck, it would almost certainly get Williamson arrested and probably tortured. If she broke under interrogation, she could expose dozens of safe houses. They authorized her to try. They had no better options. German security apparatus in occupied Poland was not incompetent. The Gestapo, Sicherheitspolizei, and Wehrmacht Abwehr employed thousands of personnel specifically tasked with detecting resistance activity and Jews in hiding. They used informant networks, surprise raids, document analysis, and systematic surveillance. They were professionals, and they were effective. But they operated on assumptions. Those assumptions, logical and generally accurate, created vulnerabilities. One assumption: elderly foreign women doing humanitarian work posed minimal threat. Gestapo doctrine prioritized surveillance of military-age men, known resistance members, and suspicious groups. A British grandmother distributing food to orphanages didn't fit threat profiles. German security services had limited personnel. They focused resources where intelligence suggested actual danger. Reichssicherheitshauptamt documents from the period show this priority explicitly. A September 1943 directive from Berlin to occupation authorities in Poland stated, "Foreign nationals engaged in documented relief work require standard border inspection only. Resources are to be concentrated on detection of military intelligence gathering and armed resistance networks. Humanitarian workers present propaganda value. Their activity demonstrates German tolerance." The calculation was strategic, allowing limited humanitarian work by foreign nationals, provided they weren't smuggling weapons or intelligence, generated international goodwill, and suggested German occupation was less brutal than Allied propaganda claimed. A British woman helping Polish orphans undermined claims of German barbarism. German checkpoint procedures reflected this. Foreign nationals with valid passports and documented humanitarian credentials received expedited processing. Guards checked papers, visually inspected luggage, asked basic questions about travel purpose, and waved them through. Detailed searches, unpacking entire suitcases, questioning every item, checking for false bottoms, were reserved for suspects, young men, travelers with irregular papers, anyone exhibiting nervous behavior. Mary Williamson exhibited none of these flags. She traveled openly, with proper documentation, on regular schedules. She carried suitcases full of children's clothing and food, exactly what a relief worker would carry. She spoke adequate German, answered questions calmly, and projected the demeanor of a churchwoman doing charitable duty. She passed through checkpoints repeatedly throughout 1942 and early 1943, establishing a pattern. Guards at Warsaw Central Station recognized her. She became routine, part of the expected background. This was exactly what she intended. But Jagoda's leadership remained skeptical of her method's scalability. In June 1943, after Williamson had successfully transported 12 children to Sweden over 9 months, a Jagoda coordinator wrote in an internal memo, "Williamson's approach works for small numbers, but cannot expand. Each journey risks exposure. Guards who wave her through today may search her tomorrow. We need systematic evacuation routes, not individual heroics." The assessment was reasonable. Resistance doctrine emphasized sustainable operations, not high-risk individual initiatives. What worked once might fail the second time. What worked 12 times might fail catastrophically on the 13th, exposing the entire network. Williamson disagreed. She had observed something the Jagoda leadership, focused on partisan operations and intelligence gathering, hadn't fully appreciated. German security forces didn't just make assumptions about threats. They made assumptions about what was possible, and those assumptions created space for operations they couldn't imagine. Before we continue, I'd love to know where you're watching from and what you know about civilian resistance networks in World War II. Drop a comment below and let me know if you'd heard about British nationals working with Polish resistance groups to smuggle children before. And if you're enjoying these deep dives into untold stories from World War II, hit that subscribe button. These stories take serious research to get the details right, and knowing you're out there makes it all worthwhile. Mary Williamson's method wasn't sophisticated. It was simple, repeatable, and depended on human psychology rather than technology. The core principle: people see what they expect to see. German checkpoint guards expected foreign relief workers to carry relief supplies, children's clothing for orphanages, food for refugees, medical supplies for hospitals. These items, properly documented, raised no suspicion. Guards inspected them visually, confirmed they matched stated purposes, and cleared the traveler. What guards didn't expect, what their training didn't prepare them for, was that the relief supplies were the smuggling operation. Williamson's method began in Warsaw safe houses, where Jagoda hid Jewish children. She would arrive with empty suitcases and begin what she called baking cakes. The term was deliberately innocuous, something she could mention in conversation without arousing suspicion if overheard. What it actually meant was preparation. She would select a child, typically age 5 to 8, young enough to follow instructions absolutely, old enough to control their behavior under stress. She would spend days coaching the child. The training was specific and exhaustive. The child would be dressed in Polish clothing, haircut in typical Polish style. They would memorize a Catholic prayer, usually the Lord's Prayer in Polish. They would practice a cover story. They were a war orphan being transported to a Swedish relief organization. They would learn to respond to a Polish name, not their real Jewish name. Most critically, they would learn absolute silence. Then came the physical concealment. Williamson would pack a suitcase with children's clothing, actual donated items from Polish churches, genuine relief supplies. She would arrange the clothing in layers. At the bottom, shoes, heavy items. Middle layer, folded dresses, shirts, trousers. Top layer, softer items like knitted goods. And in the middle layer, compressed among the folded clothing, the child would hide. The physics were brutal. A standard suitcase of the era measured roughly 60 by 40 by 20 centimeters. A small child, curled in fetal position, could fit in approximately half that space, but barely. The child couldn't move, couldn't shift position, couldn't make sound. Breathing had to be controlled, shallow, silent. Williamson would drill the procedure repeatedly. The child would practice climbing into the packed suitcase, would learn to stay motionless while the lid closed, would practice breathing quietly for extended periods. The rehearsals lasted hours. Some children couldn't do it. They panicked in the confined darkness. Those children couldn't be transported this way. Williamson needed children who could master absolute stillness. The suitcase lid wouldn't fully close with a child inside. The bulge was detectable if someone looked carefully. So Williamson modified her suitcases. She would leave them partially packed, with clothing arranged to disguise the extra volume. She would cinch the straps loosely, as if the suitcase was filled but not overpacked. From external inspection, it looked like a heavily loaded but conventional piece of luggage. The weight was impossible to disguise. A suitcase containing a child weighed 20 to 25 kilograms, far more than clothing alone. But this is where Williamson's age became an asset. She was a 55-year-old woman. Checkpoint guards expected her to struggle with heavy luggage. They didn't find it suspicious. They found it consistent with an elderly person transporting relief supplies. October 8, 1943. Williamson arrived at Warsaw Central Station with 2 suitcases. One contained actual relief supplies, clothing, food, medical items. The other contained 7-year-old Rachel Steinberg, now carrying papers identifying her as Christina Kowalska, Catholic orphan. Rachel had been in training for 2 weeks. She knew her prayers. She knew her cover story. She had practiced the suitcase procedure until she could enter silently, arrange her body efficiently, and remain still for 45 minutes, the typical duration from checkpoint inspection to train departure. Williamson approached the checkpoint. The guard, a Wehrmacht Unteroffizier named Hans Becker, according to later testimony, asked for papers. Williamson provided her passport and travel authorization. Becker asked about luggage contents. Clothing and food for displaced children in Sweden, Williamson said. Donations from Warsaw parishes. Becker gestured to the suitcases. Open them. Williamson opened the first suitcase, the one with actual supplies. Becker inspected it visually, lifting a few items. Satisfied, he pointed to the second suitcase. Inside that suitcase, Rachel Steinberg heard the sound of latches clicking. She had been trained for this moment. Don't move. Don't breathe heavily. If light enters, close your eyes. Open eyes might reflect light and draw attention. Williamson opened the lid partway. The suitcase was packed tight with clothing. Becker looked at the layers of fabric, saw children's dresses and sweaters. He reached in, lifted the top layer slightly. Beneath it, compressed in darkness, Rachel held absolutely still. Becker's hand was centimeters from her. If he probed deeper, pushed the clothing aside, he would feel her. The operation would end. Rachel would be arrested. Williamson would be arrested. The Zagota network would be exposed. Becker withdrew his hand. Gut. He waved Williamson through. She closed the suitcase, latched it, lifted both pieces of luggage, and walked toward the platform. Her pace was steady. Not hurried, not relieved, just an elderly woman catching a train. Inside the suitcase, Rachel remained motionless. The train wouldn't depart for another 30 minutes. She would need to stay silent and still through boarding, through departure, through the first hour of travel. Only then, when the train was well outside Warsaw and Williamson had secured a private compartment, would the suitcase open and Rachel could breathe freely. The journey to Stockholm would take 4 days, crossing through occupied Poland into East Prussia, then by ferry to Sweden. Multiple checkpoints, multiple inspections, each one a potential catastrophe. Rachel Steinberg reached Sweden on October 12, 1943. She was one of 200 children Mary Williamson would transport using this method before Germany's collapse in 1945. Mary Williamson's technique succeeded because it exploited systematic gaps in German security procedures. Post-war analysis by intelligence historians identified 3 specific vulnerabilities she leveraged. First, checkpoint procedures prioritize speed. Wehrmacht and Gestapo personnel inspected thousands of travelers daily. Detailed searches, unpacking luggage completely, examining every item, checking for concealed compartments, required 5 to 10 minutes per person. Standard visual inspection required 30 seconds. German doctrine specified detailed searches only for high-probability threats. An elderly British woman with documented relief credentials didn't meet that threshold. Second, human perception is pattern-based. Guards expected luggage to contain what travelers claimed it contained. When inspection matched expectation, suitcase labeled as containing clothing opens to reveal clothing. Guards' cognitive processing categorized it as confirmed and moved on. Detecting an anomaly required breaking the pattern recognition loop and examining the context more carefully. This required suspicion, which required trigger indicators. Williamson provided none. Third, social dynamics inhibited thoroughness. German soldiers inspecting an elderly foreign woman's luggage, particularly when that luggage contained children's clothing and food, faced social pressure against excessive intrusion. Being too aggressive with a grandmother doing charity work appeared brutal, potentially generating complaints to superiors. Guards naturally erred toward less intrusive inspection unless specific intelligence suggested threat. Williamson understood these dynamics instinctively. Her background as a schoolteacher had given her decades of experience reading human behavior, understanding authority structures, and projecting trustworthiness. She knew how to be simultaneously cooperative and unremarkable. She answered questions directly, but didn't volunteer extra information. She made eye contact, but didn't stare. She appeared tired from travel, but not nervous. The intelligence value of her operation extended beyond the children she personally rescued. Jagoda leadership recognized that her method could be adapted and scaled. If one foreign national could smuggle children, others could as well. Between late 1943 and early 1945, Jagoda recruited 7 additional foreign volunteers, 5 women, 2 men, who used variations of Williamson's technique. Not all attempts succeeded. In March 1944, a Swedish volunteer named Erik Lindstrom was caught at a checkpoint in Krakow with a 9-year-old Jewish girl hidden in a trunk. The girl panicked during inspection and cried out. Both were arrested. Lindstrom survived interrogation and was eventually repatriated in a prisoner exchange, but the girl, Miriam Levin, was sent to Auschwitz. She did not survive. The failure revealed method limitations. The technique required exceptional children, those who could control fear absolutely, and exceptional escorts who could maintain composure under interrogation. It also required luck. German security procedures varied by location and by individual guard temperament. What worked at Warsaw Central Station might fail at Krakow or Lublin, but the broader strategic impact was significant. German intelligence, when it eventually recognized the smuggling pattern in late 1944, struggled to counter it effectively. Increasing checkpoint thoroughness for all travelers would create massive delays and generate complaints from legitimate foreign nationals, creating diplomatic problems. Targeting specific demographics, elderly women, relief workers, would appear discriminatory and undermine propaganda about German civilization. The SS issued a directive in December 1944 requiring more thorough luggage inspection for travelers carrying children's items. But by that point, Soviet forces were advancing into Poland, and German administrative control was collapsing. The directive was inconsistently implemented. Post-war interviews with surviving Żegota members revealed that Williamson's operation inspired broader adaptation. Resistance networks began using similar principles, hiding contraband in plain sight, leveraging assumptions about innocent categories, using demographic characteristics as camouflage for other smuggling operations. Weapons were hidden in medical supply shipments. Intelligence documents were concealed in religious texts. Resistance members traveled disguised as priests, nuns, and Red Cross workers. The lesson was profound. Sophisticated security systems optimize for known threats. That optimization creates predictable blind spots, and those blind spots can be exploited systematically by operators who understand the system's logic. Mary Williamson completed her final smuggling run on January 12, 1945, evacuating 3 children from Warsaw as Soviet forces approached from the east. She reached Sweden on January 18th. She never returned to Poland. Over 28 months, she had transported 200 Jewish children to safety, an average of 7 children per month, 1 child every 4 days. The survival rate among those children was extraordinary. Of the 200 children Williamson evacuated, 197 survived the war. 3 died in Sweden from illness, unrelated to their transport. By contrast, the survival rate for Jewish children who remained in hiding in Poland was approximately 30%. Mathematically, Williamson's operation saved roughly 140 lives, children who would statistically have been captured and murdered had they remained in occupied Poland. After the war, Williamson returned to Britain and resumed life in Manchester. She did not discuss her wartime activities publicly. No memoir, no interviews, no public recognition during her lifetime. British intelligence had been aware of her work. MI6 received reports from Żegota through Swedish intermediaries, but classified details remained sealed until the 1970s. She died in 1967, age 79, largely unknown outside a small circle of Polish expatriates and Jewish survivors who had maintained contact. It wasn't until 1982 when Israeli historian Yehuda Bauer published research on Żegota operations that Williamson's role became documented in academic literature. In 1985, Yad Vashem, Israel's Holocaust Memorial Authority, posthumously awarded Mary Williamson the title Righteous Among the Nations, an honor given to non-Jews who risked their lives to save Jews during the Holocaust. The ceremony was attended by 12 survivors she had rescued, now adults with families of their own. Rachel Steinberg, the 7-year-old hidden in a suitcase at Warsaw Central Station in October 1943, attended that ceremony. She had emigrated to Israel in 1949, married, raised 4 children. She told reporters, "I remember the darkness inside the suitcase. I remember learning to breathe silently. I remember thinking if I made any sound, I would die. Mrs. Williamson taught me that I could be braver than I thought possible. That lesson shaped my entire life." The broader legacy of Williamson's operation influenced post-war understanding of resistance methodology. Holocaust historians identified her work as exemplifying civilian initiative operations, resistance activities conducted by individuals outside formal military or intelligence structures. Unlike partisan fighters or intelligence agents, Williamson had no specialized training, no organizational hierarchy, no operational support beyond basic Żegota logistics. What she had was moral conviction, observational intelligence, and willingness to accept personal risk for strangers' lives. These qualities, post-war analysis suggested, were more important than military training or organizational resources in certain resistance contexts. Her methods also informed Cold War escape operations. Western intelligence services studied Żegota techniques when developing East-West German border crossing procedures. The principle, hide the valuable asset in plain sight among innocent-appearing items, became standard tradecraft. Modern human rights organizations working in authoritarian regimes cite Williamson's operation as a model for evacuating at-risk individuals without sophisticated resources. The core principles remain applicable. Understand security system assumptions, operate within those assumptions' blind spots, maintain unremarkable appearance, control fear response. The 200 children Mary Williamson saved produced an estimated 1,800 descendants as of 2020. That number will continue growing. One British grandmother, operating alone with suitcases and courage, created generations that Hitler's machinery intended to erase. History celebrates the dramatic gestures, the commando raids, the intelligence coups, the battlefield victories. We study operations with code names, involving trained specialists executing complex plans. Those operations matter. They shaped outcomes, saved lives, won wars. But Mary Williamson's story teaches something different. Sometimes the most effective resistance is the quietest. Sometimes the greatest victories come from people who simply refuse to accept that nothing can be done. She wasn't a trained intelligence officer. She had no military background, no resistance network experience, no specialized skills beyond a school teacher's ability to read people and prepare children for difficult tasks. What she had was clarity about what was acceptable and what wasn't. Watching children die when she could potentially save them was not acceptable. The risk to herself was irrelevant against that calculation. The suitcases were never sophisticated technology. They were ordinary luggage that happened to contain extraordinary cargo. The baking cakes methodology wasn't elaborate tradecraft. It was patient preparation and exploitation of human assumptions. 200 children survived because one woman decided that German checkpoints, despite their systematic efficiency, had weaknesses, and that those weaknesses could be exploited with nothing more than suitcases, Catholic prayers, and absolute composure under pressure. The lesson extends beyond World War II. Evil functions through systems, bureaucratic, logical, apparently unbreakable. But systems are designed and operated by humans, and humans make assumptions. Find the assumptions. Operate in the space those assumptions leave unguarded. Summit. If you found this story as fascinating as I did researching it, I'd appreciate if you'd like this video and subscribe to the channel. There are dozens more untold stories from World War II that deserve to be remembered, and I'll be bringing you a new one every week. What should I cover next? Let me know in the comments below.